The Vengeance of the Witchfinder by John Bellairs and Brad Strickland. Chapter 8. Once again, the train pulled into the country station. Once again, Jonathan and Louis stood on the platform surrounded by their luggage, and once again the boxy old Austin 7 came puttering toward them with the tall, lean figure of Cousin Pelly behind the wheel. But this time, Louis felt a suffocating dread. Part of it was the weather. The sky did not seem to have changed since they had left Barnevelt Manor more than a month earlier. The gloomy gray clouds seemed so low that you could climb up a tall ladder and touch them. The air was muggy and close, just like the oppressive atmosphere in Louis's nightmare. The whole world seemed waiting for something to happen, something awful and deadly. The car crashed to a halt, and Cousin Pelly climbed out. He clapped his bony hands together. "So, home of the travellers, eh? So jolly. Ripping times await us, I can tell you," he grinned wolfishly. Louis caught his breath. Was this gentle eccentric cousin? Was this his gentle eccentric Cousin Pelly? The old man's eyes were red-rimmed and the flesh under his cheeks had sunken in. His wild silver hair had not been trimmed. His smile looked sly and knowing. Louis felt his uncle start in surprise. Then Jonathan said, "Yes, Cousin Pelly, we have returned. It will be good to rest in the ancestral mansion tonight. I hope we aren't inconveniencing you." Pelly gave him a sharp, suspicious look. "Inconveniencing me? Nonsense! I want to show you all the hospitality that Barnevelt Manor offers. We have to stick together, what? After all, we are the last living male Barnevelts." And then Pelly snickered in a most unpleasant way. "Come along, get your baggage. I can hardly wait to get you back to the manor." Jonathan and Louis loaded the luggage into the car. Jonathan kept glancing at his oddball English cousin. He could not put his finger on it, but he knew that the old man had changed somehow, and not for the better. Jonathan sighed. He knew that something was bothering Louis, too, something that his nephew was not ready to talk about. Although Jonathan had tried to remain cheerful and upbeat during the long trip, he was well aware that Louis occasionally had nightmares. Several times, Louis's groans and moans had wakened Jonathan at night. But Louis had never complained or asked to talk about whatever was bothering him, and Jonathan felt that he should respect his nephew's privacy. He knew that sometimes people had troubles they simply had to work out for themselves. Now, though, Jonathan began to regret not offering his help to Louis. He waited until Louis had squeezed into the back seat of the car, and then he climbed into the passenger seat beside Pelly. As Pelly started the ancient automobile, Jonathan took out his pipe. He had almost stopped smoking over the past year, and was determined to cut out tobacco altogether as soon as the supply ran out this time. But right now he felt like a meditative pipe. He puffed away as the car careened along the narrow road toward Barnevelt Manor. For his part, Louis felt his discomfort increasing as they clattered between the fields of the grazing sheep. He looked away from the hedge maze as Pelly turned in at the drive. That was why Louis was looking straight at the gatekeeper's cottage as they passed it on the right, and there was a white, hollow-eyed face staring out at him. It was only a momentary glimpse, but Louis could see the deep-set, glaring eyes, the tight-lipped grin, and the clenched, crooked teeth. Louis glanced at Jonathan, but his uncle had noticed nothing. He merely sat staring straight ahead, his pipe clenched in his teeth. The Austin creaked to a weary halt in front of the manor, and old Jenkins came out to help with the luggage again. This time the servant did not speak at all. He just gave both Jonathan and Louis a long disapproving gaze, as if he blamed them for the stifling weather and the general atmosphere of gloom. They took the same rooms they had occupied before, and Louis was grateful when he reflected that a door led from his bedroom directly into Jonathan's. If he felt really frightened, he could always get up and leave the communicating door open, and maybe lock the hall door to keep the ghosts and ghouls out. This time, no mid-morning snack awaited them. Mrs. Goodring told them that she had made sandwiches for lunch, but her voice was low and troubled. She kept her hands clutched to her apron as she spoke, and she kept stealing nervous glances at Cousin Pelly. The very idea had not been absurd. Louis would have guessed that she was afraid of the harmless old man. If the very idea had not been absurd, Louis would have guessed that she was afraid of the harmless old man. Louis set off to find Bertie, who was playing, Mrs. Goodring said distractedly, somewhere about. He found Bertie outside, behind the house. Bertie sat with his back against an oak tree, his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hands. He tilted his head as Lewis approached and said, "Who's there?" "It's me," said Lewis ungrammatically. "We got here as soon as we could." He took a long and careful look around. Jenkins was doing something in the garden off to the left. He was much too far away to hear the boys. No one else was around. Still, Lewis lowered his voice as he sat next to Bertie. "What's up? I got the note you sent." Bertie took a long, deep breath. "Crikey, but I'm glad you're back. Oh, Lewis, I've had a terrible summer. Do you have bad dreams about you know what?" Lewis flinched. He had expected trouble of some sort, but not that. "Yeah," he admitted. He hesitated, but then he went on to describe the awful nightmares to Bertie. He found that he could finally talk freely about them, since Bertie had shared his adventures in the hedge maze. It was a relief to spill out all his fears at last, even though talking about them made Lewis breathe faster and made his heart race. So then I always wake up," he finished. "I guess you've been sleeping pretty badly, too." "Yes," Bertie said. "Only mine are sort of different. In my dream, I hear hushed sounds everywhere. From my closet, from under my bed, from outside. It's a lot of tiny voices speaking in whispers, just too low for me to hear. Except I hear my name every once in a while. Bertie, the voices will say." Bertie shivered and hugged his knees against his chest. "And there are other sounds, too. Sounds like an enormous spider, as big as a plate, walking slowly across the floor toward my bed. Tapping sounds at my window like a skeleton drumming its fingers on the glass. I just lie there terrified until I wake up and the sounds stop. Sometimes I think they go on a little while after I wake up." "Wow," Lewis said in an unsteady voice. He had never been particularly afraid of the dark, but then he could chase it away with a flashlight or a match. He had never considered what awful nightmares a blind person might have. "I don't think I could stand a dream like that," he admitted. "That isn't the worst," whispered Bertie. "Two other things happened just last week. That's why I sent you the card." "What?" asked Lewis, though he dreaded hearing the answer. Bertie lowered his voice even more so that Lewis had to lean close to hear him. "First, a gentleman from London came and asked to rent the gatekeeper's house. Mr. Vanderbilt agreed and he moved in. But Lewis, he's horrible." Lewis began to shiver. "Get hold of yourself," he thought. "You can't show Bertie that you're afraid." He cleared his throat and said, "How do you mean horrible?" Bertie shook his head miserably. "Oh, I don't know. It's hard to describe. I was out front when Jenkins hauled his trunk into the gatekeeper's cottage, and I think the man walked past me. I felt something cold the way you feel sometimes on a hot day if a cloud covers the sun. It was just like a cool shadow passing over me. And the man said, 'What a likely-looking lad.' Just that, and nothing more. But his voice, Lewis, sounded like those terrible whispery voices I've been dreaming about. It sounded like the voice of a ghost. And I don't think I can talk about this." Lewis put his hand on his friend's shoulder. "You can tell me," he said. "You're good old Watson, remember?" Bertie smiled, but Lewis saw a tear creep down from behind his green spectacles. It surprised him a little. He had not stopped to think that a blind person might be able to cry. Bertie took off his spectacles and wiped his eyes on his sleeve. Lewis noticed that he had blue eyes, and they looked normal, except the pupils were very wide and black. Bertie slipped the glasses back on and said, "Thank you, Holmes." Then he took a couple of deep breaths. It's hard to say this, and it sounds crazy, but Lewis, the man has no footstep." Lewis frowned. "What do you mean?" "You know how I got to recognize your footsteps so fast?" Lewis nodded without thinking, then said, "Yeah, that's a neat trick." "Well, I can't hear this man's footsteps at all. He passed right by me, and I couldn't hear the grass rustling. He stepped up onto the threshold, and his boots made no sound at all. And twice, when I've been out, he's suddenly spoken to me from quite close by, and yet I've never heard him approach." Lewis understood his friend's fear. Now that he thought about it, being blind and not hearing someone coming might be even more frightening than hearing someone you are afraid of step closer and closer. "What did he say to you?" stammered Lewis. "Nothing important. Once he said, Quite a lonely life here, lad? And the other time he just said, old houses have their own spirit, don't they? You see, it wasn't really what he said that bothered me. It was sort of what he didn't say. Said Lewis. You mean he might have meant you were all alone here and there's no help for miles the first time, and Barnevelt Manor is a haunted house the second one, or something like that? Exactly, agreed Bertie. He was, now what is the word, implying more than he actually said, and he knew that I would understand that. Lewis swallowed. What was the second bad thing that happened? Promise you won't laugh? Of course not, said Lewis with some surprise. Well, the chickens died, all of them. What? Lewis did not know what to make of this news. Did an animal kill them, or? No, Bertie said. The morning after the strange man first showed up, Jenkins went to collect the eggs as usual. He came back very upset. Every chicken was lying dead on the ground, but none of them had any injury. At first, we thought it might be a disease, but the vet checked some of them and said that he couldn't explain it. They just died, as if something might have frightened them to death. Lewis shuddered. He did not like this piece of news. It reminded him too much of the awful night when something had chased him and Bertie. He himself had felt almost on the verge of dying from fright then. After a moment, Bertie went on. And ever since Mr. Prester, that's his name, Jenkins says, Mr. Matthew Prester of London, moved into the cottage, Jenkins and Mr. Barnevelt and even Mum have changed. They seem frightfully nervous and edgy. Mr. Barnevelt snaps at me if I make any noise at all, and he's never done that. And Mum gets cross at me as easy as anything. Oh, Lewis, what are we to do? Lewis bit his lip. That was the $64 question, all right. What were two boys to do when they were up against something they could not begin to comprehend? But even Sherlock Holmes must have been a boy once, Lewis reminded himself. Every great hero has to begin someplace. After a few moments, Lewis said, Okay, here's what I think. First, we can't go to Cousin Pelly and complain about this Matthew Hoosus. I know Pelly needs the rent money, and without any evidence, he wouldn't kick this guy out of the cottage. So before we go to anybody, we have to make sure that the fellow is up to no good. I think I might have seen him when we drove in. Somebody peeked out at us from inside the cottage. He looked about as bad to me as he sounds to you. Still, you just can't go by appearances. I guess we have to find evidence. Evidence of what? Asked Bertie. I don't know, confessed Lewis. Something that might prove to the others that this man isn't what he seems. I'll try to question Jenkins without making him suspicious, and maybe the two of us can sneak up to that cottage and see what he's doing there. Are you with me? Bertie gave him a sickly grin. As always, Holmes. Stout fellow, said Lewis. He hoped his voice sounded a lot braver than he meant at the moment. Jenkins had gone inside by the time they finished talking, and Lewis did not see him anywhere about. At noon, Mrs. Goodring called the two boys in for lunch. She said that Uncle Jonathan and Cousin Pelly were out having a stroll around the grounds. So Bertie and Lewis ate together at a small kitchen table. It was not much of a meal, just some toasted cheese sandwiches and milk, and a small slice of cake each for dessert. After lunch, Bertie asked if they might go outside to play, and Mrs. Goodring said they could. Mind you, hurry right back inside if it begins to storm, she said, with an uneasy glance out the window. The clouds still hung unbroken and threatening, and the air fairly hummed with the tension that precedes a really big thunderstorm. The two boys went outside and circled around the hedge maze. The summer had been hot and dry, Bertie said. The rank grass on the front lawn had died and dried. It now stood stiff and yellow, a thick, sedgy growth. That reminded Lewis uncomfortably of the field he had waded through in his nightmares. The brick cottage looked deserted as Bertie and Lewis approached it. The windows were all dark, and no one had bothered to sweep away the pile of dead leaves that had blown up against the front steps. They lay there, ankle-deep and undisturbed. I don't get it, muttered Lewis. The place looks empty. How long has this Prester guy been living there anyway? Bertie thought back. A little more than a week, he said. This is Tuesday. He came a week ago yesterday. Well, he hasn't turned on the lights or swept the steps or washed the windows, said Lewis. In fact, he hasn't done anything. Then he stopped a few feet from the house. Lewis braced himself. I'm going to peek through the window, he said. Do you think you ought? Stammered Bertie. I have to, said Lewis. You can't do it, and we need to know if he's in there. Be ready to run if I yell. You know which way the manor is. Sure, said Bertie. We're on the driveway. You just follow it up until it circles the house. Okay, said Lewis. Here goes. He crept up to the house. The windows were in sad shape, blurred and bleared with layers of ancient grime. He shaded his eyes and peered in through one foggy pane. The house was decidedly gloomy inside, but gradually, as his eyes became accustomed to the dimness, Lewis began to make out shapes. He frowned. The room he was peering into looked unlived in. A bed, shrouded under a dust cover, stood near the window. Aside from that, he could see no furniture at all. A door opposite the window was open and led into a room that looked like a kitchen, with an old-fashioned wood-burning stove just visible. Off to his right was the closed front door. The little cottage appeared to have no other rooms, unless a bathroom lay beyond the closed door to the left of the kitchen. Empty, Lewis reported to Bertie. What now? Well, I vote we knock on the door and see if anyone is home. If he is, you just introduce me and say I'm visiting. If not, we'll see if the door is unlocked. Lewis! Exclaimed Bertie. Isn't that breaking and entering? Not if we don't break anything. It's just entering. Lewis paused. He was not at all positive he was using proper legal terms. But this was no time to hesitate. He continued, and besides, we'll just take one quick look and then get out of here. Well, all right. Bertie did not sound happy about the whole idea. They walked to the front door where they scuffed through the dead leaves. Lewis tentatively rapped at the door. It gave back a hollow, vacant sound. Here goes nothing, said Lewis. He reached out to touch the doorknob. What's that? Asked Bertie in a sharp, frightened voice. Lewis had heard it too, a slithery, rustling, creepy noise. It came from the side of the house. He looked and saw the tall, dead grass stirring as if something big were stalking through it, heading for them. Run! He yelled. Bertie broke for the manor at once, with Lewis right at his heels. Behind them, something growled. Lewis cast one terrified glance back when he was halfway to the manor. The grass beside the drive waved wildly as something huge and invisible bounded through it. Whatever had chased them through the maze at midnight was loose again. Lewis forced his knees to run harder, faster. His breath burned in his chest, and he could barely manage to pull even with Bertie. They came to the circular drive around the house and crossed that, and Lewis heard a frustrated low growl from behind. He looked back again. It stopped, he panted. Then he remembered the awful night that he and Bertie had stumbled across the same drive. It can't cross the drive, he said. Something is keeping it out. Bertie collapsed and lay on his stomach, breathing great ragged gasps of air. Lewis bent over, his hands on his knees. Whatever had chased him had gone. He could barely see the corner of the gatekeeper's cottage down at the foot of the driveway. He blinked, and goose flesh rose on his arms. A tall, thin man stood beside the house. He had a long, pale face with deep-set eyes, and although Lewis could not clearly see his features, he seemed to be leering in an evil, triumphant way. Is that him? Lewis panted. What? Bertie asked. Lewis, you know I can't see. I forgot, apologized Lewis. There's a skinny man next to... He broke off in confusion. He had not taken his eyes away from the tall man who stood beside the cottage, and yet the man was gone. Somehow, even with Lewis staring straight at him, the baleful figure had vanished into thin air. And that is the end of Chapter 8.